They say blood is thicker than water, but when it comes to distributing your wealth on your death, human instinct can sometimes take on a darker side because money's involved. So no matter what your age, planning your estate is an important matter. Now, estate planning goes well beyond drafting a will, so no matter how young or old you are today, I really think you're going to benefit from my chat with Ken Race. Estate planning, you see, involves arranging your assets and circumstances in such a way as to ensure that your beneficiaries after your death receive your assets and they get the maximum use of them and they get the maximum enjoyment of them at a minimum cost in tax and in heartache. Now, you can't start too early. Unfortunately, over the last couple of years, I've seen some people in their 20s and 30s end up having wished that they had planned their estate. Well, they didn't, but their estate did when sudden things happened. Now, I don't want to sound morbid, but you should plan to become the person you plan to become, as you've heard me say so often, in all sorts of ways, and part of the plan is estate planning. So today I have a chat with Australia's leading property tax strategist, Ken Race, and together we explain what estate planning really is, what you should do about it. So welcome to today's show.
Welcome to the Michael Yardney podcast, where twice each week you will learn a number of new ideas regarding success, property investment and money in around 30 minutes. Our show is brought to you by Metropole, who specialise in helping you grow, protect and pass on your wealth through strategic property and wealth advice. Now here's your host, Michael Yardney, Australia's authority in wealth creation through property, who has been voted one of Australia's top 50 most influential thought leaders.
Now, when you heard the original introduction to this show, you're probably wondering, is this a topic you need to learn about? Do you really need to know about estate planning? But my simple answer to you is yes, you do. Estate planning is different for everybody, especially in today's modern environment of so many extra blended families. And with more people remarrying, it's more critical than ever to prepare for the distribution of your wealth when eventually one day you're going to pass. Of course, while you're alive, the estate planning process allows you to manage and it allows you to preserve your wealth for, let's say, one day when you're going to leave things behind. And that's what we're going to discuss today with Ken Race, who's widely regarded as Australia's leading property, tax and wealth strategist and director of Metropole Wealth Advisory. Hi, Ken.
Hi, Michael.
Now, estate planning, it sounds boring. What is it?
Yes, I think the purpose of a good estate plan is to anticipate and plan for the financial and personal problems your beneficiaries of your estate may face after your death. So really a good estate plan helps minimise all those concerns and issues and just leaves them time to just grieve.
Now, again, it's a morbid sort of discussion. But if the last couple of years taught us anything, we've got to expect the unexpected from external sources. And I know you and I have only in the last couple of years also come across a number of friends, clients, also who have had unanticipated health issues and unfortunately even death. So let's put the morbid bits aside and let's make sure that we are prepared for those things. I guess it's in some ways a form of insurance. So what does estate planning involve, Ken?
Yes, and the word estate has got a very particular meaning, and that's why most people get it wrong when they say, I have a will. So the first issue is to recognise that a traditional will only looks after those assets in your personal name. These are referred to as estate assets and hence estate planning. The issues, however, are far greater than this because most people have non-estate assets, and this includes superannuation, control of trusts as an example. And these assets require different documents to manage them after your death. So they're not part of your will, they are side documents, but quite critical because a lot of people have significant assets, particularly in super. They might have life insurance. So there's quite large numbers there for most people.
Now, I think we've also got to early in the piece, we always have a disclaimer at the end of the show, explain that while Ken is an expert in this field and also has, apart from his accounting degrees and real estate license, a financial planning license, this is not specific advice for you. We don't know your circumstances. I don't know if you're in your 60s or your 20s. And whatever age you are, this is still relevant, Ken, isn't it? Because if you can plan ahead, it's often hard to undo some of the structures and plans that you've made if you leave it too late.
It certainly is. And while a lot of things can be undone, the tax consequences are huge. So get it right first time.
Okay, so most people would say, I got a will, or I've actually just bought one of those wills online and you can do that. And they think they're covered, but you've already hinted that that's not enough. So what sort of documents are included and what elements do you have to take into account when you're thinking about estate planning, Ken?
You've really got to consider capital gains tax and stamp duty, the efficient tax management of...
In other words, the passing over your assets in the most tax efficient way that your estate, your beneficiaries keep the most of it and the government gets the least of it.
Correct.
But to do it correctly and you're not trying to cheat anybody.
No. And while the passing of your assets on death is tax-free, it's what income is earned from those assets that has to be managed in a tax-effective way. Because most people aren't going to blow all the money and buy a house, so to speak. They're going to invest it and earn income, dividends, interest, rental. And depending on how you received your inheritance will actually directly impact on the taxes you pay on those incomes you receive when you invest. So tax-effective management is critical.
Well, I guess one of the things that I'm concerned about, I know other parents are concerned about, is how safe are the assets going to be when we pass them on to future generations? Is there going to be issues from disgruntled family members who miss out? This gets even more concerning if you've got a blended family, doesn't it? And what if you've got debts, Ken? I'm asking you a whole lot of questions that I guess you're going to work through.
I was just noting them down.
I remember for years my mother said, when are you ever going to own anything? Because I always had debt, and I still have debt, but it's much more manageable. But I'm actually happy to pass my assets on to my kids and grandkids, but I'm also going to be passing on a whole lot of debt. So I've thrown a whole lot of things at you. Let's work through those one by one.
So you've really got to start saying, how safe will those assets be in a particular person's hands? So you have to understand what your children or grandchildren or surviving spouse does. Are they in a litigious profession? So they don't want assets in their personal name. There's different ways to move that intergenerational wealth so that it makes it hard for a disgruntled family member to sue the estate if they miss out or they didn't get what they wanted. And that's an area of litigation that's growing more and more in Australia. And as you pointed out, when you die, your debts aren't absolved. Your estate still owes that money. And, the banks can come in and sell things and get their debts repaid. So you've got to take all that into account when you're moving assets and how easy it'll be to change titles of assets after you've transferred them. Because most people have to think intergenerationally, not just once, but twice. So things have to be flexible enough for this coming generation and the one after, I say, at the very least. So that's why a simple will just doesn't work, because it doesn't take into account all those what ifs and needs for flexibility.
So let's make it clear. A will is for your own assets. You mentioned it before, but a lot of sophisticated investors own nothing in their own names or minimal, and a lot in other structures. So a will doesn't cover that, does it?
No, because the will is only the things in your name.
So what other documents do you need, Ken?
Well, the biggest non-estate asset that people have is their superannuation. It's hard for people to get their head around that I don't own my super. So you've got to put in other paperwork to say, what happens to my super on death? And you've got to look at certain things. Does it stay in super? Does it come out where it's protected? There's lower tax rates. The family home. So there's different ways to own the family home, either jointly or tenants in common, and that has to be looked at. So life insurance proceeds have to be considered, how you're going to pass them on. In the majority of cases, they're tax-free, but notice I use the word in the majority of cases. In some instances, they're not. So you want to make sure that even your life insurance is set up correctly. And then, we've all heard about, the hidden gem in the attic, some long-lost artifact or family heirloom that could be worth a lot. So you've got to consider the passing down of those personal effects and who they're going to go to.
So who should somebody be seeing about this? Because this is now getting much more complicated.
It is. And as we've seen, there is tax, there is asset protection, there is future flexibility you need. So the standard, can I call it the $30 will kit, just doesn't work for most people. And we see time and time again litigation against those. So people then traditionally go to the local suburban lawyer or someone they've known. But as we've seen in the last few minutes, you've got to take into account many more aspects than just who am I going to give those assets to. So that particular person you go to has to understand tax, they have to understand asset protection, they have to understand the different ways that a main residence can be treated, they have to understand future flexibility, trusts, a whole gambit of things, which is really not normally the purview of a standard lawyer doing wills.
And let's be blunt, that's an area that you and the team at Metropole Wealth Advisory are specialists in. Now, you don't do it all yourself, but you've actually got a team of consultants who specialise in this. And it gets even more complicated because, as I said at the beginning, a lot of people have blended families. And so what goes to this person? What goes to that set of children? What goes to everybody equally? What if one particular spouse dies before the other? How are their kids looked after? So it can get very complicated, can't it?
It certainly can. And we don't have that concept of prenuptials in Australia like they have in America. Our binding financial agreements in Australia are really only valid if the circumstances at the time of signing it are exactly the same at the time of wanting to be implemented. So if a spouse signs it, but then, falls over, hurts their back, they can't work, what they said they were prepared to accept is no longer valid because their circumstances have changed. So we've got to be very careful if we want to leave out a black sheep in the family because they can have a claim. So you've got to do all that correctly. You've got to be careful, I think, on, as you just mentioned, it goes to a spouse, they remarry, the original spouse dies, and then it all goes to the other family, and then children can miss out. So we've got to be very careful to protect those assets, particularly to the second generation. And a good estate plan will cover that.
Interestingly, then you need an expert in estate planning, and we'll leave a link for Metropole Wealth Advisory in the show notes. But the bottom line is you need somebody with a more holistic approach than just a solicitor and I guess just an accountant. I mean, there's lots of things to think about, and I've been through the estate planning process a while ago. Who's going to be the executor of your will? Who are the beneficiaries going to be? And are they going to be able to manage the value of the assets that you're passing on?
That's right. So they're all considerations you've got to make at the beginning. It's no use saying person A is going to be my executor because they may not want to take on that position. So you have to have fallback positions and flexibility. So in reality, it takes a tailored and detailed estate plan to actually make things simple are more efficient for your executors and beneficiaries. So this is one of the few times when less is more doesn't count. It actually makes it easier to have a little bit more complexity up front.
Now, I know there are some people saying, oh, Ken's just trying to sell his services. I know there are other podcasts that actually say you shouldn't put things in structures. It's just accountants trying to make things more complex to give them annual fees. While you are an accountant, that's not what you do. What would you say to people who say this level of detail is really just being paranoid?
Look, depending on the reports you read, there's between 50 and 70% of people die without a will.
Really?
It's huge. And luckily, the legislation's changed that the government doesn't get it. But there is now standard percentages that go to children or to spouses. So that could go to a completely inappropriate person for you. And over the next 25 years, there's going to be $3.5 trillion worth of assets transferred to the next generation. They're the baby boomers. So that is bigger than the value of the stock exchange and about a third of the value of the total housing stock. So we're talking large numbers there. So, when people say, I don't have very many assets, surprisingly, when they count their home, their life insurance premiums, their personal effects, their superannuation, there's quite large numbers there. So we've got to put in place a robust solution to make sure that the people that you want to benefit from your estate and non-estate assets actually are the ones that actually get it and not, the ring-ins.
I guess we hear a lot about when somebody dies and money gets in the way, families start arguing, families start fighting. Whether the claims are legitimate or not, it gets very unpleasant. So I guess if you have it documented, it's going to protect those that you're leaving your assets to.
That's right, because the law allows for litigation by authorised persons, and there's categories of people who are authorised. Their legal bills are paid out of your estate, whether they win, lose or draw.
Really?
Yeah. So that's why you see a lot of litigation against estates, because the person, can I say, wanting more, doesn't have to put their hand in their pocket to pay for the legal advice. So we've seen instances of estates being dwindled to a fraction of what they were before after the payment of these legal expenses. So the more robust you make it at the beginning, the less costly it'll be, and more importantly, the less chance there'll be for litigation. But those aspects of being able to have your legal bills paid out of the estate are there as a safety net for the vulnerable people, for the less fortunate people who don't have the money to take on a claim, and therefore they need some sort of assistance. But I think the pendulum is way over the other side. That's my personal view.
So what I'm hearing is that a correctly implemented estate planning strategy will create a will that will reduce the risks faced by your beneficiaries. It'll create a plan that the inheritance will minimise costly disputes and taking money the wrong way. What about family court and bankruptcy and divorce and relationship breakdowns? How do you take that into account?
Unfortunately, one of the biggest concerns a lot of my new clients have is, if I pass down the assets to my child, what happens if they get divorced? So this traditional documentation would be, it goes to your child, they get divorced, the assets could go to the spouse, the ex-spouse. But that does not have to be the case. A different type of documentation, a different type of will, actually will protect those assets. So even though your child is divorced, they don't go to the ex, so to speak. Now, as a human being, you still want to look at child maintenance, things like that if you've got children. But in a lot of instances, you want to make sure that the children are taken care of, not the ex that's going to go and spend it and frivol it away.
I can see why it gets so complicated, Ken.
Yeah. So a lot of instances, we hear the term ruling from the grave. So I'm not a believer in ruling from the grave, but a properly documented estate plan helps the next generation with guidance. So guidance from the grave. Because we want to leave things a little bit flexible, because we see, particularly in superannuation, taxation legislation, that can change over time. So you don't want to make things too rigid, so that changes to those laws actually make your original documents less effective.
So what documents are we talking about? We've discussed a couple of things, the will. What other documents are there? I know that there's a whole lot that you prepare as part of the estate planning strategy that you give to clients of Metropole Wealth Advisory.
So I think there's got to be a will, which is who gets what. So you got to decide who gets what. But then the how is critical. How do they get it? And that's going to give you the robustness, the safety, in case it goes to a child, they get bankrupt, or the child needs medical assistance, or your child gets divorced. That is the how they get it. So traditionally, if it goes to somebody in their name, then all bets are off. Those assets can be lost. So you need a different how. And that's when people start using testamentary trusts, as they start using trusts. And people always say to me, oh, but Ken, there's a trust now. What do I do? The trust is only set up after you die.
Well, the testamentary trust is. That's a special sort of trust. Definitely.
It's a special sort of trust that has got different tax rules applying, different asset protection, different family law court. So that sort of estate plan, including a testamentary trust, I think is a very valid strategy for a lot of people.
Well, I know my mother set up her testamentary trust in 1996 and didn't end up having it come to fruition until she unfortunately died 6 years ago, which was, 30, 40 years afterwards. But boy, is it a very efficient way of me, who's got the assets, and my sister, who's got her share of the assets, to be able to distribute to grandchildren in a very tax-effective environment, Ken.
That's right, because normally the tax rate to a minor child starts at 66% and slides down to 45%, plus Medicare. But out of the testamentary trust, that minor child would be taxed at the adult tax rates. So we need...
So they've got a whole lot of potential income, which helps pay for the school fees, at no tax at all.
Correct, with pre-tax money. We need an enduring power of attorney. A will only is triggered upon death. So if you're in a coma, if you've lost your faculty, etc., your will doesn't kick in. So the enduring power of attorney allows somebody to stand in your shoes, sign documents, make decisions. We need medical directives. When do I turn off the switch if I'm on a ventilator? Guardianship, control of trusts, including superannuation. So a lot of people believe that on death, all your money has to come out of super. That is not correct. So you can keep the deceased spouse's super funds in a super fund and be paid out to the surviving spouse. That's particularly important if you've got a property in your super. You don't want to be forced to sell that property. A lot of circumstances are required around the capital preservation. You might want, the current generation to live off income. They can't sell assets, but then that's available to the next. So all those special considerations have to be taken into account. The movement of control of your trust. Who will be the appointer? Who will be the trustee? That, again, is separate documentation. So that really all comes together so that the next generation has a more robust way of managing and keeping assets that you've worked hard for.
So there's a whole lot of areas you've got to look at. And that's again why, in my mind, it needs a estate planning specialist like you and the team at Metropole Wealth Advisory. It's not just tax, but you've got to look at your ownership structures, taxation, superannuation, looking after your dependents financially. What about businesses, Ken? Because a lot of people listening to this are going to be in business. You've got to take care of that as well, don't you?
That's right. You're going to have shareholders agreement, unit holders agreement, buy-sell agreements, right of first refusal. One of my previous businesses with two other partners is, well, if one of us passes away, we don't want the spouses to come in and make decisions. So how do you look after the spouse of the deceased partner, but still allow the business to continue? That is very, very critical. And that will have completely different tax implications if you're in business as well. So really what we're talking about is estate planning involves a will lawyer, an accountant, a tax specialist, a self-managed super fund specialist, a commercial lawyer, someone who can give you general counsel on things to think about. So that's why we say at Metropole, you need that holistic view to bring all those pieces of the jigsaw puzzle together.
Sure. And one person can't do it all, and they all speak different languages, don't they? The accountant is going to speak very different languages to the solicitor or the property people or the business partners. So you need somebody who can interpret them and speak the same language.
That's right. And ask the right question.
That's important.
Which is what most people don't look at. It's just, yep, I need a will. And out of the people who have a will that we see the majority didn't realize that they could have made it more robust, could have made it more tax effectively, because they weren't given the options of these different alternatives. So even those who have a will, in the majority of cases, then change it to something much more appropriate to their family circumstances.
So I think when most people talk about estate planning, they're talking about who's going to get it, when in fact a better question would really be how.
How? That's the third question. Who and what? Who gets what? But the how is the critical one, which I would say in 4 out of 5 cases is really not investigated.
Very much so. And I would agree with that in my experience with speaking to people as well. And I guess, as you're saying, the how is more important. So let's just talk about a couple of the typical strategies that you and your team at Metropole Wealth Advisory use to help clients protect their assets for the future generations.
Look, we typically see mistakes being grouped around 3 broad areas. The first one is around superannuation death benefits. And while we're not giving superannuation advice here, this is general advice. A lot of people believe that on death, their superannuation has to be paid out, when that's not the case. It can stay in super for the benefit of the surviving spouse, where it's paid out periodically without tax, no income tax on the earnings, no capital gains on the sales, but it's still flexible enough that the surviving spouse can sell. That then goes to the next level, is if there's a property in super. And typically clients with a self-managed super fund with a property, the super fund is roughly split. There's not a lot of other assets. So that means on the death of one spouse, the property has to be sold, which could be at a time when the market's dipped and many other reasons. So you want to be able to know that you could keep the property in super until there's a more appropriate time to sell, if you want to sell. There's a lot around super, and who the money goes to in super is taxed completely differently. Yeah, one of the bugbears I have is children can get money out of super. But then the ATO has another rule of, yes, they can get it, but do they pay tax? So a tax dependent. is a child under 18 or 25 if they're studying. Yes, they can get it. But if you give it to your 20-year-old child who's working, they will be taxed. So you've got to sort of determine the different buckets you have of funds and determine, well, this bucket will be used to pay that person, this bucket will be used to pay that person.
Okay, so super's one area that you see a lot of mistakes being made in, and so therefore estate planning mistakes, therefore we've got to think about that. What are other typical mistakes you see happening?
I see that a lot of people, if they give money to a surviving spouse and really don't think of what happens next. So, when the surviving spouse dies, it then goes to children, where if they're divorced, you could lose the assets. If the child is sued, you could lose the assets, the minors tax. So we really need a structure that will go to the surviving spouse that is then picked up by the next generation.
I guess I'm just thinking, Ken, also a lot of people that you see and give advice to own their home in the name of the non-litigious spouse. In other words, if a husband's a plastic surgeon, it goes in the wife's name. But what happens if, unfortunately, she dies first? All of a sudden, the family home would end up in the name of somebody who could get sued. That'd be an issue, wouldn't it?
We've actually got a couple of clients at the moment, new clients, with that exact same problem. And their concern is, well, at least a house in a personal name gets the benefits of tax-free, no land tax, and they take the risk and then say, okay, I'll have the house in my name. But you actually can shift that property to the litigious spouse, the surviving, without it going into their name. So therefore it's protected against litigation. And under that structure, the capital gains are still tax-free. You don't pay land tax. So you can have your cake and eat it too. And that's a very typical one. And with the family home, if it's joint ownership on the death of one spouse, the other spouse automatically picks it up. Or there's tenants in common where each spouse owns their bit and then their will takes over. So in a lot of instances, we actually move the ownership from, call it joint, to tenants in common or vice versa to get a better outcome. And
okay, other mistakes that you see people making, Ken?
Look, we've got a client at the moment who is helping their grandchildren, with school fees and things like that. And they've got adult children, of course, and then grandchildren. So we put a strategy in place that the grandchildren could actually benefit from the superannuation of that particular person, which meant money will go to the grandchild out of the super, tax-free, the income, capital gains will be tax-free, none of this 66% minus tax. So grandchildren, in some cases, not all cases, can actually be looked after as a dependent for tax purposes, which most people don't appreciate you can do. So
I guess another mistake people are doing is giving their assets to children who could either be in a litigious profession or more likely to be getting divorced. That could be an issue as well.
That's right. And look, we're doing some work with some clients at the moment who are worried about asset protection. And, they've been promoted. They now manage a factory. They've taken on all the occupational health and safety. But 5 years ago, that wasn't a problem. So while they don't have their own business, they're an employee that takes on those responsibilities. So when you're moving assets then to a child who has those sorts of accountabilities and responsibilities, again, you want to make sure that they're protected in case there is litigation. So again, that's one from left field, but one you should consider.
Well, Ken, it all sounds very complicated, but that's not a reason not to do something. I know some people are going to bury their head in the sand and hope it doesn't happen, but what do they say? The only things that are inevitable are death and taxes. So you want to avoid the tax side because you're not going to be able to avoid the death side. So if people are sitting here listening to this or riding or driving or whatever they're doing, and they're wondering, what do I do now? What advice would you give them?
Look, two things, and we say death and taxes. A lot of people who use trusts, either as a part of their estate plan via testamentary trusts, or they have normal trusts, they stop after 80 years. And then there's the assets have to move out of that trust, which can be a capital gains and a stamp duty trigger. So our assets, our trusts don't have an end date. And that's very important when we're talking about estate planning, where funds eventually go to a grandchild, which they can still be alive in 80 years' time. So we see a lot of clients who, can I say, live by the acronym SKI, spend the kid's inheritance, thinking, I'm not going to have this problem. But at the end of the day, you've still got your house, you've still got your superannuation, and that can be quite a significant amount of money. So that means the division of that can be hundreds and hundreds of thousands to a child or a grandchild. So I think we need to seek independent advice in a holistic way with someone who can give guidance on, as we say, taxation, trusts, asset protection, super, business continuity, as we mentioned.
Yeah. And also professional practices too, I guess, are a form of business.
Correct. Estate planning really involves arranging your assets and circumstances in such a way as to ensure that your beneficiaries after your death receive your assets with maximum use of enjoyment, minimal costs, minimal taxes and heartaches, and protected for then the next generation.
Well, I think that's what everyone would really like, but until they've heard you now, they probably thought, oh, that's easy. But it's not, is it?
It's not. It's very easy to get, a $30 will kit, which in my eyes, I think isn't even worth the paper it's written on.
We keep saying that. I wonder whether there are still $30
No, there are.
Really?
Look, if you've got nothing and you've got $10,000 in your bank account and you've got no relationships going, at least say, give it to one of my siblings. But as soon as you start having property, the home, a life insurance policy, a little bit of super, you need to go up a level. And I think that standard will that 30 to 40, 50% of people have, then don't look after the other aspects of what happens next. Is it protected? What happens if my spouse gets remarried? Will my children still get it? If my child gets it and then gets divorced or is sued, will those assets remain in a safe environment? So I think estate planning should be an efficient, safe and effective way to move your wealth from one generation to another, but still allow you to enjoy your lifestyle while you're alive. Because, you still got to have fun while you're alive. You still got to go on holidays, et cetera, but then know the next generation, your surviving spouse, will be looked after with minimum heartaches in this paperwork.
Well, I would recommend people think about their future and invest in their future, because they're going to live there and their grandchildren and children are going to, by spending some time with you. And we'll leave a link in the show notes, but just go to Metropole and leave your comments there. Just ask to have a chat with Ken. There's a lot of different places on the Metropole website, metropole.com.au, where you can just ask for a consultation, but ask to speak to Ken about estate planning, or go to the wealth planning tab where you'll see about Metropole Wealth Advisory Services. Now, Ken, estate planning is one of the things you and your team do, but it is a lot more that you can offer clients. So if they are going to speak to you, what other services can you help them with?
Yep. So we help a lot of clients understand their business structure. Is it the correct structure for what they want? Is it the most appropriate? Is it being operated correctly and efficiently? A lot of people come to us to say, how do I build up that wealth? How do I own my assets? Is it appropriate for me to use trusts or not? It's how to set up my super. How do I buy a property in super? So it's that holistic approach to wealth creation so that you can actually grow, protect, and pass on that wealth. So the estate planning is a small slither of what we can do for clients. And it's all about, as you said, bringing it all together, because normally if you go to profession 1, profession 2, profession 3, they don't talk to each other. So this is a way to actually get a coordinated approach to get you the result or the best chance of getting the result you want. And
now, we were looking the other day at the statistics of our last podcast together and how we were number 1 or 2 in business in Namibia and some far-flung countries.
Yes.
But I also think that there are a lot of expats listening to this. Well, I know more than think I know, because you see a lot of expats who've got a whole different set of circumstances, not just in estate planning. So that's an area that you specialise in as well, because they've got their own tax challenges, don't they?
Their own unique circumstances, while they're away, the tax treatment of their assets, if they're buying new assets. You've got to be very careful if you're selling a family home while you're living offshore. There's quite punitive tax charges on selling a home, which would traditionally be tax-free. So, or people migrating to Australia who have got assets overseas. So there's things you can do to significantly reduce the tax liabilities if you sell those assets once you become an Australian tax resident. So either an expat or people migrating.
There's a whole range of services you provide our clients at Metropole Wealth Advisory to help them grow, protect and pass on their wealth. I'll leave a link in the show notes, but simply go to metropole.com.au, leave us your details, tell us that you'd like to have a chat with Ken about estate planning. And Ken, are you happy to have just a quick preliminary chat to see if people will get benefit from your services?
Oh, absolutely.
I shouldn't have offered that. You're going to get inundated now,
yes.
But that's okay, because if you've offered it, we've got to now. I've forced you into it. So we're now, force was a strong word. So now you've made yourself available. So if you're keen, why not just click on the link at Metropole, have a chat with Ken, see how he and his team can help you. Ken, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you, Michael.
Well, thanks for spending the last little while with Ken and me understanding about estate planning. And please pay attention to the advice Ken gave, because unfortunately you never know when you need it. I was almost about to say you never know when your time is up, but unfortunately I've seen some people in the last couple of years. I've experienced some issues with family, friends and clients where illness and unfortunately even death came upon them, and it was unexpected. So if you haven't got the multiple documents that Ken was talking about ready for you and your future generations, why not see somebody like Ken? Go to metropole.com.au and leave your details in the wealth advisory section there. But if you got some benefit from today's show and you know somebody else who will, you know somebody else who would also benefit from getting their estate planning under control, tell them about the Michael Yardney podcast. There's a share button on every podcast app, or just tell them the old-fashioned way, or you can tell the world by leaving a review on wherever you listen to the show. I'll be back again real soon, but you can catch me on social media. Just look for Michael Yardney. And in particular, I'd love you to join me in my private Facebook group, where every day I leave something a bit different, special, unique, that you won't get elsewhere from me, about property success, money. Just go to Facebook and look for the Property Update Facebook group and then join thousands of others in getting this information. As I said, I'll be back again real soon. In the meantime, have a great week. Make it a great week.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Michael Yardney podcast, which was brought to you by Metropole, who help their clients grow, protect, and pass on their wealth through strategic property and wealth advice. If you like what you heard and don't already subscribe, you'll find us on iTunes or on your favourite Android app as the Michael Yardney podcast. Watch out for our next show, which comes to you twice a week, and you'll learn some new ideas about property investment, success, and money in around 30 minutes. To get more of Michael's thoughts, go across to www.propertyupdate.com.au and sign up for his daily morning briefing, and you'll hear from not only Michael, but a group of leading property success and money experts. And just a reminder that the information you heard in this show today is general educational advice and not specific investment advice, as we don't know your personal circumstances. If you're looking for specific advice, why not ask the team at Metropole to help you?